I would like now to ask Mustafa, please, to start his presentation. He'll be talking about governance of mobility, contested territoriality, political vacuum, and state rescaling. Um, so this paper will, his presentation will argue that governance of mobility is the most challenging and yet the most important task a political authority is to undertake if it is to exist. The arguments that he will be putting forward will be developed with reference to two recent and very hot or burning political issues hitting Turkey, the recent round of Kurdish uprising and the Syrian conflict, in parallel, of course, to the refugee crisis.
Hello. So can you hear me? Okay. Okay, so I think I would, if I were to give another title to this presentation, I would call it State Rescaling in Times of War and Crises. Well, actually, let me start with this. Do you see this? This is the capitalist state now. In the past, it was right here that was the capitalist state, the nation state, right? But now it's rescaled, institutionally speaking, but also stretched to the market and civil society. And we have here the intermediary institutions at different scales. So all those intersection points, they refer to different nodes or, of the power structure. So they are interconnected. And in my presentation, I'll be talking about 4 different scenarios, actually. State rescaling, depending on the nature of the territory it's based on, we could come up with 4 different scenarios of state rescaling, which is state rescaling 1 and 2, where we have a rather stable territory under the control of the state, the nation state, but in the first instance, there's an unshared and single central authority. In the second one, divided shared central authority, as in the case of Lebanon. And the third one is state rescaling, but also is part of state rebuilding, where the central authority is challenged and there's a contested territory, as in the case of Turkey. And the state building, where the central authority fallen and there's re-territorialization of political power and contested territory. The case of Syria, where the ISIS versus the Rojava, the Kurdish, the Syrian Kurdistan's experience. I will get back to the story. But here, there's one point that I would like to underline. The basic assumption is that there is territorial integrity in the state rescaling process. Now, the points of departure, well, if we are to talk about the relationship between the scale or the state rescaling and the question of mobility, then we should concentrate on the question of territory and territoriality. Thus, we can talk about the tensions between mobility and fixity. So, but the widely shared assumption in the literature on capitalist state rescaling and reform is that there exists a stable polity, some sort of a kind of political and social consensus without serious territorial disputes, right? So there are clearly defined borders and concomitant strategies of territorial organizing and controlling what remains within those borders. So we are talking about controlled mobilities, tamed mobilities. And there is one nation state, but there are no contenders to the single center of power, no parallel state-like structures. So the whole issue is then the tensions revolving around centralization versus decentralization, really. But the thing is, the nation states are incomplete projects in terms of their territoriality. They are never territorially finished. And they are never in total control of their own territory. So we can talk about there are always political vacuums and policy vacuums. So a state cannot be expected to control its own territory and cannot be expected to project its own power onto every single part of its territory. But the creation and maintenance of the nation state as a special fix amounts to minimizing those political vacuums. So how do you minimize those vacuums? By controlling the mobilities within. The circulation of capital, the movement of people, right? This is how you create, and you do this by, you render the country governable by creation of spatial fixes at various scales, city, region. So what happens, then the question is what happens when that territorial order is challenged or shattered? So here enters the question of mobility first versus fixity. And here actually I follow Eugene McKen's take on that, the dualisms that he wrote. Kevin Ward said, like a recent article, right? It's a short one. Well, I'm not using mobility and fixity as dichotomous categories, but as intertwined, mutually constituting and reinforcing categories. So what do I make of this? So if we are to talk about political and policy vacuums, we can further refine our framework of analysis by talking about mobility within a fixity, where we are talking about controlled, tamed mobilities, and which are minimizing the political or policy vacuums as stable territorial order. The second instance, the mobility is caused by unsettled fixities, where the political vacuum, the shattering of a nation state, Syrian regime falls, that creates refugees. The third one is those mobilities, the refugees, are unsettling the fixities, unsettling the order in Turkey, the territorial order in Turkey, or unsettling the political order or territorial order in Lebanon or Jordan, right? So creating political and policy vacuums. So then, I thought about what kind of an example I would come up with. Then I thought in Ankara too, I'm from Ankara, but in Istanbul too, I see the Syrian kids, like poor kids, like begging on the streets. So that I asked myself a question: how come this poor kid from a suburb from Lebanon, from Aleppo, ends up in Ankara? Probably that kid, she used to just play, right, with her friends on the street, like safely, you know. Now, what is she doing there? And what does this have to do with the question of mobility and vacuums? I think this is how the story goes. First, mobility phase one. So if we are talking about mobility, we could talk about the phases and types of mobility and types of different political vacuums and policy vacuums. Here we go. So the family decides to flee the place of living to another city within the nation state or to another country, to Turkey. So there is apparently a national political vacuum in Syria. So the nation state shattered. Different groups fight over that territory. The mobility phase two, then there is international barriers there are international barriers that they are supposed to cross if they can make it, either to the old Turkish-Syrian border or to the Mediterranean Sea where they die. Right? And apparently there is an international political and policy vacuum, right? No one is controlling the Mediterranean. And what will the EU do about them, right? Or what will Turkey, because Turkey has no relations with the Syrian regime anymore. So apparently there is an international and political policy vacuum at a different scale, right? Then the mobility phase three, those people across the Turkish border, then there's international mobility. They are traveling in Turkey to different cities to find a place that they can settle, or to other European countries. But there, in the case of Turkey, there is a national political vacuum because they cannot control what's going on within the borders. And they have no policy whatsoever about how to deal with those refugees in Turkey. So there is a policy vacuum. Well, as far as I know, 1/4 of the refugees in Syria are in the camps. The rest are circulating freely in the country. And the government, the central government, and local governments do not know what to do with them. Right? So then the mobility phase four, so that family now, they're settled in a city, but it's very hard for them to find a job or a place to settle in the first place. There is a huge bus terminal, intercity bus terminal in Ankara, and I used to see families, not like kids, like the whole families, like a dozen of them sleeping just by the gate in the fall or just near the winter, right? So that family is is mobile in the city. There's intra-local mobility in Ankara, right? But there's no local government authority intervention, so there's local policy vacuum, right? And then there's micro-local mobility, so they're finally settled. But the kids get to the streets, moving and for beggary, under the control of the Turkish and Syrian/mafia. So there's a local political vacuum. No one is in charge of the streets. Right? So this is what I mean by political and policy vacuum, and it takes place at different scales. So then if we are to talk about state rescaling and territoriality and thus political and policy vacuums, well, state rescaling is a product, an arena of hegemonic struggle where the allocation of resources, there's a fight over redistribution on resources, and there are alternative visions of state society clashing, right? Also, I think all these presentation is about this, but in the meantime, as I prepared this presentation, I tried to be in dialogue with other presentations and the past works of the co-presenters and other colleagues. And this hegemonic struggle definitely has territorial references where I talked about in detail in my IJUR piece. And also, I think Yasin's piece also supports my conclusions. But I really here benefit from Eugene's emphasis on the explanation of the whole process, where the process of rescaling necessarily entails a disruption and recomposition of the networks of power that tie political actors together within and across scales. So the development of a new scalar fix, meaning that institutional reform, spatial reform, means that new opportunities emerge for political action as others are curtailed. So in a way, it's a power play who will try to have different political groups try to have an upper hand in controlling the whole, this capital state I gave you the picture in the first place. But I think Eugene McKenn's observations could be stretched not simply to the power play, but also to the realm of civil society and market, because we are talking about a hegemonic struggle. So the contestants, they try to organize and establish networks at different scales within and across civil society and the market too, right? And under the influence of globalization and neoliberal policies, the capital states have been reorganized, as we see, but now there are different stories emerging. So we have two variables here at work. One of them is the nature of the central authority, the existence or non-existence of power sharing at the national scale, and the second one is the nature of the territory, whether it's stable or unstable. So using those two variables, I established those four scenarios. So this is scenario one. Well, so here, okay, you remember that chart, the first one that I showed you, okay? This is it. Okay, here is probably that this is visualization, like departing from Eugene's framework and what I did before. So that would be the field of hegemonic struggle, or how it's conducted. And their state rescaling would be about where would be the center of power, or the weight of the power distributed in this framework. Where should it go? Where should be the weight center of this arrangement? Should it go here? Should it go here? Should it go here? Should it go here? So all institutional reforms are about or determined by the balance of weight within that system. But this is here, the assumption is that this is a stable territory. So no one is sharing really this. There are no parallel state-like structures here. And this hegemonic struggles are really about redistribution of nationally produced surplus value and to introduce a new vision of state and society, right? And to contain, the ultimate aim is to contain and control the central authority, though, with redistributive concerns. So that was the essence of my paper, the IJUR paper. But here comes the second scenario. I guess Lebanon would fit into this framework. So here we have the national state. So there's a stable territory. No one is now fighting over territory, right? But there's a divided and shared central authority, right? Different groups, like Hezbollah controlling like part of the government, like Christians controlling another part of the government, right? This is distributed on the basis of the ethnicity and those groups. And those groups have their own civil society organizations and market connections, right? So here I think probably there will be no room for hegemonic struggle, because you cannot win others. You have already divided the territory and the civil society and market already. But there are parallel state-like structures. So what happens then? The problem then appears to be a policy vacuum right here, right? Because in those territories, in the cities, people coexist. Although there are different groups controlling those different groups in enclaves, so how will you coordinate the different projects? Then comes not a political vacuum, but a policy vacuum. I think that's why there is some room for institutional reforms, for regionalization. I think Mona's and Yara's paper fits into that framework, so that it could begin to take root in this complex policy environment, but politically more stable, right? So this is scenario C, where now Turkey, like post 2013 or 14, Turkey would fit in. Okay, but here I'm talking about the Kurdish movement in particular. So there is now a contested territory, the southeastern part and eastern part of Turkey, right? The Kurdish movement tried to make inroads into the national parliament by creating a legal party, right? In the meantime, they pressed for demands to create regional government structures, autonomous ones, and also they began to control the municipalities. In the meantime, those municipalities were in touch with the semi-public, civil society and semi-public, semi-private institutions. But as they did so, they also tried to organize the civil society in their localities. They created parallel state structures, starting from the neighborhood level up to the national scale. But as they did so, they did not simply suffice with the national boundaries or where the Kurdish population lived in Turkey, but also they began to establish ties with Syria and Rojava. And they began to establish ties with the civil society institutions, and markets, like they began to establish horizontal ties across the Turkish-Syrian border, right? So then their claims for state rescaling amounts to not simply rescaling the state, but also rebuilding the state and re-territorializing the state. Right? So in that regard, those struggles waged through network building and over the networks to re-territorialize the state involves institutionalization or organization of informal everyday governance regimes and setting them as alternatives to the dominant formal governance regimes. So I benefit from Seth's work where you can have the formal governance regimes and informal governance regimes, but what Kurdish movement was doing, they tried to formalize those informal governance regimes to render it as an alternative to the Turkish nation state. And in a way to transform it, not to break away from it though, right? So, and there are also parallel state structures that Odd's previous work on Palestinian Authority and especially Hamas really makes sense. And there, the networks, unlike in the first scenario, are transnational coalitions stretched across the borders. So then state rescaling is a strategy to achieve re-territorialization, not simply for redistributive purposes. And in this scenario, winning the excluded and other parts of the territory is not shaped around redistributive concerns, but rather on the idea of, 5 minutes? I'm almost done. Rather on the idea of rebuilding the state, right? So it's in a way state building strategy. So what's going on with the Kurdish issue in Turkey is quite similar to the Palestinian Authority's strategy. But the case of Hamas then is different. But the still final aim is to contain and control the center of authority. The Kurdish movement in Turkey, they do not simply want to just break away from Turkey. They try to change the very definition of the Turkishness or the citizenship at the central level. So, and the final scenario is that in the same old territory, the old Syrian territory, we have two contestants. The PYD, the Rojava, the Kurdish case, and the ISIS. And they use state rescaling or institutionalization to build their own territory this time. This is purely state building. So the same territory shared, and the thing is, there are clashing visions of state and society, and there is no room for hegemonic struggle. And they designed that scholar structure of the state to fill in a political vacuum and to build legitimacy for the movements. Why we have a canton model in Rojava, an emirate model ISIS? Because those contested territories serve as new legal habitats characterized by open-ended potentials and danger. But theirs are zones of exclusion from Seth's another work, from neoliberal global capitalism, where alternatives to capitalism are promoted or explored. Eco-socialism of PYD and Sharia law of ISIS. Right? So then the struggle is over the territory, and associated scholar design aims at state building while reshaping the civil society. So they are not doing this simply to build a state, but to reshape their societies, to reshape their economy, right? So the relationship between state rescaling and territorialization is totally different in that case. So this is, I think, where I stop, and we'll talk about the detail. These are the references. Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mustafa. I think it was quite
Done?
interesting to see things through these lenses.